Watchman.
DJ
What's up?
Leroy.
Yo. All right. Okay. So we've heard, of course, the phrase that democracy in the balance.
Mm-hmm.
We have the midterms tomorrow, buddy. Tomorrow, Tuesday. So
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen? What are your predictions, man?
Well, as the Temptations put it, eve of destruction, tax deduction. I don't know. um, we're here to find out. Obviously, in many situations, it's too close to call. But there's certainly troubling things that make, at least myself, I feel like there are more. The stakes are even higher on this election than they've been in the last two, and maybe it's because of what's happened in the last two. But let's not just toss it about ourselves. We've got a couple of very esteemed guests that have some informed opinions, and I think we should bring them on right away.
Okay, you know what? Hey, why not? What do we have up? And this is his first time on Soul Lounge Primetime, and that is Dr. Basil Smikle Jr. Give it up. Come on. How
Good to
you
be
doing,
here.
Doc?
I'm doing well, man. How are y'all doing?
Beautiful, beautiful, my
All right.
brother. Like I said, man, you're going to answer the question because I'm troubled. I'm really, really troubled. So you're going to tell me I've seen you countless times, MSNBC, CNN, Bloomberg TV, all of those things, and you seem to have a certain calm. But should I be alarmed? You're going to answer that. And you know what, Night Watchman? Let's bring up the other talking head, the other expert in this, Dr. Wallace Ford. Bring him up. Hey,
They're not
guys.
just talking heads; they actually have full bodies underneath the boxes here.
Okay. You know what? Let me start it out, Coach. It seems like, of course, we do know what happens with the midterms, that the party in power suffers significant losses with the midterms in terms of the House. Okay, Dr. Smikle, do you predict that it will indeed be the case tomorrow on voting day?
Oh, that Democrats lose significant seats in the House? Yeah, I do
Yes.
predict that to be the case. The real question is what will happen with the Senate, and I think that is a question with so many big races across the country, Ohio, um, North Carolina, where you have African American Cheri Beasley running, Florida, where you have Val Demings running, Wisconsin, where you have Mandela Barnes running. So what's the common thread? There are a lot of black folks on the ballot for statewide
Indeed.
office this year, and so clearly the Democratic advantage is hanging on a thread there. And if, to me, if we lose both houses, it's
Game
gonna
over.
it's we're in for a fair amount of pain going forward, but certainly a
Wow.
lot of gridlock with a Democratic president um, and a divided Congress.
Gotcha. Dr. Ford?
Yeah, well, I'm going to take a little different view of it and I think this is something that's really certainly been the case in the last 20, perhaps 30 years, is that the bright, shiny object, of course, is Washington, D.C. And so we focus on who's going to be president, who's controlling the state, who's controlling the Senate. But, and as Brother Smikle will certainly attest to this as well, the Constitution.
Uh-oh. I watch. What?
Investing significant power in the states, okay, and the states is where the really the game that we don't play enough. Okay, something like 30 of the state houses are controlled by Republicans right now. 26 of the governors are Republicans right now, and there's something like 300 plus election deniers running for governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and attorney general seated across the country. Okay, red state, well, they're mostly red states now, not blue states. Of course, here in New York, we've got the possibility that a Trump embracer like Lee Zeldin would be close to becoming the next governor of the state of New York. It tells us that there's tides that we need to pay more attention to. And so I would just say that going forward, when we're looking at the election results on Wednesday and going forward from there, watch what's happening in the states. because if they get control of 33 state legislatures, you can change the Constitution. That's 2/3. Not 33. I'm sorry, 34. You can change the Constitution. And so 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 50th, you pick them, are all on the line at that point.
Oh my God. Okay, so answer me this. So we certainly do know that the Republican Party has morphed to a Trump party, essentially. Okay, gone are the days when we had what we would deem as reasonable, let's say, Republicans, those who would actually embrace country over party. Can that ever come back, or has the genie forever left the bottle? Basil.
Well, I think it's gone at least for a generation. We see. I mean, just look at the Supreme Court. That was an intentional strategy from Republicans. And let me zoom out a little bit. I do
Hmm.
think that um, the changes that we see are a generation long, but they've also been a generation in the making. And I think it's
Mm,
important to make that point because Democrats tend to have a sort of cycle by cycle strategy, but
mm,
Republicans have been playing the long game for 20 to 30 years. This
mm,
is about it takes a long time to sort of set up, as Dr. Ford is talking about, these state legislatures. Under the Obama years, Democrats lost about 1,000 seats in state legislatures across the country
wow,
and
wow.
began flipping state legislatures because they knew that they wanted to push a lot of policy back, onto the states. Um, and when you consider the pipeline for judges, they knew that if they sort of got a president like Trump, who's not an ideologue, he's just sort of there for the long term, for the
Mm,
popularity and the agenda. He flipped appellate courts to more GOP control because of the judges that he appointed. But that doesn't happen overnight. When you consider also um, that these same state legislatures that have been flipped are the ones that have power over how we vote, right? And we
mm,
see all of these stories about voter intimidation and restrictions on voting. This is all not accidental. It's not even serendipitous. It is it
mm.
is it is intentional, and because of the time that it took and the pervasiveness of these institutional changes and changes across the country in states, um, it will take a generation to undo that at least. And so when we say that elections matter, they matter, you know. And to piggyback very quickly on Wallace's point, most of the policy that affects our day-to-day lives happens at the state level,
Mhm.
but it's also where we have some of the lowest voter turnout.
Wow.
And that has to be corrected and reversed if we're going to be able to withstand a lot of what's coming, you know.
So, and Wallace, do tell. Now, you heard a generational. That's what Basil has said. Do you agree in terms of
Yeah,
the?
yeah, yeah, yeah. A little, yes, I definitely agree. Again, to what Basil was saying is absolutely correct, which is that all of what we're talking about now didn't just happen with when Donald Trump was elected in 2016. You have to go back perhaps as far as 1964, 65, what happened then, passage of the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Bill, respectively. And there's people who at that point in time decided to be very focused and strategic with respect to what needed to be done to overturn that. First of all, you take control of the states, you got out of the Democratic Party and all of that, and turned the Republican Party into a very conservative weapon. The Democrats used to be the conservatives. Remember that?
Yeah.
Democrats were the segregationists and what have you, Stennis and
Yeah.
Thurman and all of those guys, right?
Mm,
Well, okay, so you go forward then, and then of course the second big turning point was what, January 20th, 2009, when Barack Obama took the oath of office, and that was, if the gunpowder had been ladled across the land all this time, that was the match. Okay, and at that point, you started to see again exactly what Basil was talking about, a continuation of focus on local and state governments. Okay, and obviously that ultimately makes its appearance at the federal level. People wondering, how did the Republicans become such a the majority party, and they're going to take control of the state and the Senate? When you consider, if the Republicans do take control of the Senate, the states that they represent constitute something like 45%, 40 to 45% of this country's population. It is minority rule writ large. Okay, the only example I can think of in the modern era is South Africa. Okay, and that is not an exaggeration when you consider what their agenda is.
There's also the issue, I think, of the minority rule, which is the influence of billionaires in this election and the influence they've had since Citizens United. I mean, we've had, what are they talking about? $880 million, almost $1 billion has gone into this midterms, and virtually all that money is going in on the Republican side. And so we've had this this confluence of both the old billionaires, the Koch billionaires, and then we have the new ones who are a little bit even more problematic, the so-called what the tech companies have called the PayPal mafia, which is Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and Jack Dorsey, and how these guys have worked in concert to control the flow of information as well as the flow of money. So what are your thoughts on the influence of big money in this race, and what are the thoughts on how we counteract it?
Well, if I might just,
go ahead.
The Boys from Wichita is a book that came out several years ago. It talks about the Koch brothers. Okay, the Koch brothers, again, were very intentional and very focused. And where did they get that? They got it from their father, who was one of the prime movers of the John Birch Society. You remember the John Birch Society?
Oh
Okay.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
So again, that agenda, the John Birch Society, was embedded in what the Koch brothers started to look at, and they were very intentional and have been. And so there's institutes at major universities all over the country giving legitimacy to these proto-conservative thoughts and activities. And again, Citizen United was such a game changer. Because this is the only country I know of, certainly, that proclaims to be a democracy, where indeed you see, just this incredible amount of money, going into the election process, and so you don't have, campaign spending limits. You don't have, campaign financing coming for all candidates, and so it's just really a race as to who can raise the most money to get the most commercials and ads and YouTube presence and what have you, and that's playing right into their hands. And so we really, how do you turn that around when you have a 6-3 proto-conservative majority? I'm not quite sure, because again, the Federalist Society that helped Trump choose the judges, chose the judges for Trump. Put in place people who are young, okay, and their 30s and 40s in the lower courts, and 40s and 50s in the Supreme Court. They will be around for literally a generation. Okay, and the oldest is Clarence Thomas, but he has very good health care. So I wouldn't count on him keeling over anytime soon. The rest of them, look, Amy Coney Barrett is in her 40s, for goodness sake. How long do you think she might be there? 30 years? Easily.
Yeah. Yes, incredible. Basil, take it. What I mean?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree, and that's why I was saying before. I mean, it's a the Supreme Court, the changes in the Supreme Court are a generational change, because those folks are going to be there for a while. A lot of the federal judges who have been appointed at the level below the Supreme Court and on down are young. These are young folks who, Wallace mentioned one group. There's another, the Federalist Society. There's also the Heritage Foundation, right? These are the two things that I think are really important. There are a couple of things that are really important to know. First is that there will always be money in politics. As much as we try to as much as the country tried to change this with in 1974 after Nixon, in 2002 with McCain-Feingold, and with the to do away with soft soft money and unrestricted soft money, and sort of create more restrictions on how much you can give to candidates and so on and so forth. There were always ways around it. That's how we got super PACs and independent expenditures and so on. So there's going to be money in politics, and the reality is that TV is expensive. A lot of this stuff is really expensive. If you try to do a campaign, a citywide or statewide campaign in New York, it's the #1 media market. It is extremely expensive to put one ad on the air that is going to count and matter for the candidate. That is a multi-million-dollar expenditure, and so the money is going to be important unless you're in another country. And I've done some work in other countries where TV is free, but you can only go on TV for like a week for the election. Everybody gets the same amount of time, right? Unless you're going to do that, which in a capitalist society we're not going to get to.
We're not. That's right.
There's going to be money in politics. What I would say though is I think we have to also look at what that money is being spent on. Because there's money that the candidate can have to spend on TV, as I said, and staffing. But what the Koch brothers do, and others, to Wallace's point, they spend money on the infrastructure, the national political infrastructure that is funding, the intellectual foundation of the conservative movement. That's the Heritage Foundation and all of that. So there's an intellectual foundation. There's also a lot of campaigns that we don't think about. So understand what's happening with all of this rhetoric around critical race theory and book banning at the school board level. That doesn't just happen organically. There's a force behind that.
Wow.
And let's also one of the things we haven't talked as much about lately, the Supreme Court case on affirmative action, right? Remember that this had come up before years ago with this student from Texas, if I remember correctly. I forget her name. Supreme Court voted against her. So what did they do? They went and found another plaintiff, right? And and then moving it through the court system. That's why none of this is accidental. They know that they put judges at the local level or the federal courts, that they'll get some favorable opinion that they can take all the way and trace all the way up to the Supreme Court. But all of that takes money. All of that takes political resources. And let's just be clear, when people talked about the big lie, which was, the 2020 vote, I always called it the big conspiracy, because you can't have that many elected officials across the country talking about the same issue the same way with the same talking points unless you coordinate all of that. And I ran a state party, so I know that you have to do that. All of that takes money and resources. So you can never overestimate, and we often underestimate, the ways in which financing and big money doesn't just help candidates, it helps fund the infrastructure to do all of the political activity that you see taking place.
Wow.
Yeah, one thing I just want to jump in, because I want to talk about that affirmative action case for a moment, because it's really interesting, the progression of ever since affirmative action became a thing, which really was in terms of higher education. We're looking at really the mid to late '60s is when you started to see this whole notion of an admissions process that was focused on diversity, and you've had several Supreme Court cases kind of carving out aspects of it. But this last case, which is in front of the Supreme Court right now, and you've got to hand it to the other side in terms of how they did this. The plaintiffs aren't white conservatives.
Right.
Okay, the plaintiffs are Asians. Okay, and so now there's white conservatives right behind them. And I just wrote about this in my point of view column, which I always ask people to take a look at, is thewallaceford.com. But the Asians don't realize that they're being played. Okay, because they are, it's one thing if you had, blonde, blue-eyed white conservatives, talking about no more affirmative action, what have you. But Asians are saying, no, we're being discriminated against because of some kind of advantage being given to blacks, not realizing that once affirmative action gets kicked out, guess who's going next? The Asians. Okay, they're going to be right back where they were before, and so they're being played, and it's really too bad. And when I discuss this with some of my Asian friends, they realize it. They know that these people are being played, and most Asians Americans that I've been in touch with say the polls something like 67% of Asians support affirmative action. But you can always find a Clarence Thomas in every ethnic group, right? And so that's what we have there, and it's really important because if that goes, you're going to see a trend going back to 50, 60 years ago, where it's just going to be much more difficult, and not only in education, but in hiring and in any number corporate America and any number of places where we say, well, if there's no mandate, we're just going to look for the best people possible, and you know how that always turns out.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, you guys are always talking about the Repubs doing the long game. At this particular juncture, is it possible for the Dems to look at a long game? Because as you say, Basil, you said generationally, we're screwed for the next 20, 25 years. Is it possible? What would a long game strategy for the Dems look like?
Well, yeah, it's investing in the future, and I mean that's true you see Republicans do that. I mean they may not do it necessarily with all of their elected officials, but the fact that they are investing so much. I mean, just think about the fact that they're investing resources in organizing parents at school board meetings.
Wow.
I mean, that is as grassroots as you could get. And I had always said, well, where are the Democrats in the room, right? Standing up and pushing the other side, if not supporting the critical race theory, because that's really not the argument. But where is our grassroots organizing now? When you go back to folks, and particularly given the venue here and who's in the room, so to speak. If you go back and think about Ella Baker and her organizing pre and post Brown, right? Organizing parents was not just about organizing to make schools better. It was also about mobilizing really engaged people for community-based and citywide issues, not just for schools. It was sort of a stepping stone. And I think that's the kind of work we need to get back to, something that is hyper local, something that is that invests in young talent that can grow into this work. And sometimes I don't see that. And I've made comments about Harlem and other parts of the city, and even other parts of the country, where there are a lot of older leaders that stay in power for a fairly long period of time. And what that does is it creates a chilling effect for the younger generation. They don't want to wait. They don't want to wait their turn. They don't want to, wait to get that sort of tap on the shoulder to say you're next. Because that's fine when you're 20 and 30, but by the time you're 50 and 60, you're not the young generation anymore, right? And so that becomes the problem, part of the problem, that waiting game that a lot of younger folks have found other ways to be involved and engaged in. I think that's also wonderful. But what the Democrats can do is recognize that they can play this long game if they are okay with taking some losses in the short term, realizing that it pays off in the long term. Look, the Republicans will say, we're okay with losing to Obama for 8 years, as long as we get our Donald Trump, right? Because look what happened. Once he became president, it opened the floodgates for their entire agenda, right?
Absolutely.
So we have to we just have to think long term. That's, I think, the bigger problem. It's not for lack of talent. It's just for lack of investment in that talent over the long term.
Well, it's also it's also not without precedent, okay? Because when you look at the Brown versus Board of Education case, 1954, that was at least 20 years in the making. Okay, and when you
That's
had
true.
when you had the NAACP Legal Defense Fund working on these cases, going local, then going state, and finally going federal. So it's not without precedent. And I'm afraid to say that two things happened in January of 2009. One is that in many ways Republicans really benefited from Barack Obama becoming president of the United States, because then you had the personification of what could happen if we don't try and we won't get we need to get our country back. And so whether it was the early the early movements that came up, or later on, obviously, we see in the Conservative Party, that they used Barack Obama as a really a recruiting factor. On the other hand, I'm afraid that too many of us spiked the ball on January of 2009, and it's like, okay, like now we're free. Okay, it's we're good now. We're good now, and Barack Obama never pretended to be anybody's radical progressive. Okay, and I doubt that he could have been elected being a radical progressive. But we kind of assume that the millennium has come, and we're good, and we've got Jay-Z in the White House visiting and all this good stuff. So and of course all the time Trump was coming. It wasn't going to be Trump; it'll be somebody else. Okay, and we should realize that, I mean, Basil, you and I have been following Trump for all these years. He was in town when he was just trying to get the Commodore Hotel together, and he's always been transactional. He has no particular philosophy except Donald Trump. And if at one point he was pro-abortion. They said, well, if you're against abortion, you'll get more votes. I'm against abortion. He said, look, I'll put on the Supreme Court whoever the Federalist Society wants me to put on there.
True.
Okay, I mean, very, very transactional in that regard. Whoever follows Trump will probably have to follow that same playbook. But again, to Basil's point, and I think this is, I mean, you look at the Congressional Black Caucus and see how many members of the Congressional Black Caucus have been there 20, 30 plus years. Okay, that does have a chilling effect on any new generations coming through. It's like, well, we can't get into Congress. But I'll say this, and this has to do with to your question, Curtis, with respect to what can we do, is look what happened in New York. We now have a predominantly non-white city council. We have a predominantly non-white state legislature, both state and Senate. Okay, even and this came through that same kind of hard work, and all we don't have a black lieutenant governor as well, a black attorney general, and this is not a predominantly black state. You should be very clear about that. And but people have worked towards those goals. There's no reason that can't happen in Ohio or Tennessee or Pennsylvania, a lot of other places. But again, we've got to stop focusing on that bright shiny object and understand that there is the long term that we've got to play, because the other side has been playing the long-term game. And you remember the Super Bowl where there's a Dallas Cowboys tackle. He picked up a fumble and started celebrating about 5 yards before he got to the touchdown and knocked the ball out of his hands. I can't remember his name. We all remember the incident, right? And it's like, we spiked the ball just too damn early, and now we are paying the price for it. It is going to be a very difficult time.
So now I'm a little sad because you brought up my Cowboys, man. Lifelong fan.
Then you remember that. You remember that play. Then
I absolutely remember that. I know I'm a New Yorker, but I got to say I'm a lifelong Cowboy fan. I tell you another point that I think is the two things you said that are really critical. One, about turnover. One of the things that really struck me in this last mayoral race is that there wasn't one white elected or leader that was a consequential endorsement in these races. You know what I mean? But that there wasn't like a senior white elected whose endorsement could like really turn or have a substantial effect on the race. And that suggests to me, and what I'm saying is to Wallace's point, that look at our city council, look at our state assembly and state senate, look at how diverse our leaders are. And one of the reasons that, I mean, if you even look at Brooklyn, what happened in Brooklyn several years ago? Major Owens and Ed Towns retired more or less around the same time after they did like 20 years, 25 years, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And look at what happened. that opened the door for all of these folks to run for office. And and with term limits, you had a lot of turnover, and it's allowed Hakeem Jeffries to be one seat away from Speaker of the House of Representatives, right? And it's actually an extraordinary turn. Now Brooklyn's a borough, not one neighborhood like Harlem is, for example, but that turnover allows for a lot of young people to really be able to sort of step into the breach. Now, I'll also say, and I think this is an important point as Wallace talks about Brown versus Board of Ed. It's important to note that around that time, as African Americans were pushing for community control, they were pushing for more equity in schools, they were pushing to desegregate. White folks started to embrace the same kind of civil rights tactics, but for their own purpose. They sort of co-opted those tactics for their own purpose, and so in many ways, they took from us again. They learned what we did, but then use that strategy to push for their own objectives that were certainly not in line with Brown, the letter or the spirit, and anything else that has come after that. And so it's clear that it's clear that every action on the part of folks of color who've pushed for equity and has been met with an equal and opposite reaction from those who push back against it.
Yeah.
Well, again, playing that long game, and again, we see it obviously with the overall conservative movement. But keep in mind that the Dobbs decision, which basically overturned Roe v. Wade, didn't just happen. There's people who literally in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was the decision of the Supreme Court, that they started working to get to where we are with Dobbs, and look, that took damn near 50 years to do. But they were prepared to play the long game to get what they wanted. And we live in a country that seems to be focused on immediate gratification, and I understand it. We all understand that. But politics and government and policy, requires a longer term focus. And I also would add, just to Basil's point, I teach at Medgar College, and I see our students actually going into electoral politics. We see our students seeing that as an opportunity in Brooklyn, as opposed to, frankly, as a lifelong resident of Harlem since I got out of law school. We never had that here in Harlem. Never had that here in Harlem in any way of encouraging and telling young people that that there are opportunities in that system. And part of it, of course, is Brooklyn's just larger. There's more congressional seats, assembly seats, council seats, etc. But Basil is absolutely right that in many ways, in some areas, not just in Harlem, but across the country, people stay in office till they pry it out of their cold dead fingers, which just is not a way. That's not the long game. That's not the long game.
Well, okay. So, gentlemen, one of the things I certainly have heard in terms of some of these people in power staying in power until my cold dead hands. Certainly now, I would submit that the seat of Black political power is no longer in Harlem.
Oh, absolutely, no question.
Okay.
No question.
Brooklyn, I would say that they have it a lock on that. Can
followed closely by Queens. By the way,
That's right.
Really.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
that's right.
absolutely.
Oh, okay. So then tell me, what can be a remedy in terms of really getting some people who are in power to stand down? Is it term limits that you can not run for no more than for 20 or 25 years at the most, and then you got to try to do something else? What are your thoughts? Tell me, someone.
Well, I'll just say quickly, again, I've lived in Harlem, since I got out of law school, and so that's going on 50 years, right? And Harlem is not a Black community anymore. Okay, it's just not. Yeah, if you live here, you see the transition over. It's not a Black community anymore, and it never will be. Okay, and
Right.
so people
Okay.
just need to understand that. So if there's any path towards political power, it's going to be with coalitions. It's not going to be we just want black people in positions, because the days of Adam Clayton Powell and all of that, those days are gone. Those are, and it won't come back. And I keep saying to my neighbors and friends and colleagues, the notion that somehow we want to keep Harlem the way it was is not the story of New York City. It's not the story of Harlem. Harlem was a white community before it became a black community.
That's right.
An overwhelmingly white community.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it would transition, and now it's transitioning into something else. And either you change or you wind up in a museum somewhere.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely right. I mean, this is the coalitions are becoming more. Coalitions have always been important to politics, but in terms of black political power, it becomes more and more important now because you've had a huge a reverse migration where you had hundreds of thousands, a million African Americans moving here in two great migrations in the 20s and then during and after World War II. And now over the last decade, 20 years, you've seen a massive out migration of African Americans from New York City. Um, eh, a lot of that is tied to housing, right? And costs and taxation, job opportunities, right? The same things, similar things that what brought African Americans here from the South into the North. But Wallace is right. Harlem is a very different place. If you just look at the housing that's being built and how costly that is relative to the wages of African Americans here in cities throughout the city, that many of these properties are prohibitive for a lot of those families. So where are they going to go? Um, so in terms of how do African Americans, how do Black people, sort of maintain or grow political power? Look, I think it's extraordinary where we are. We got a Speaker of the Assembly who's Black and from the Bronx. We've got the Majority Leader of the Senate who's Black, a Black woman from Westchester. Our mayor is Black. The second in line to be Speaker of the House is Black from Brooklyn. Our Attorney General is Black from Brooklyn. Our public advocate is Black from Brooklyn. Right? That's what I
Yes.
meant.
Yeah,
That's what I was saying.
the Speaker of the Council.
Speaker of the Council is Black from Queens. So that's the thing. It's like when I was coming up in politics, and I started. And I'm 50 years old this year, but I started.
Congrats.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 2 months away from 51, but I'm hanging on to 50 as long as I can. But I started working for Freddie Ferrer when he was borough president and I worked for him in the mid '90s, right out of graduate school.
Nice.
And when I was starting out, every major, every there were so many political leaders who were white who were consequential in city and statewide politics, and those seats now belong to Black people. And I mean that is a sea change in my professional lifetime, and that's extraordinary. The question is, how do you keep that going? You keep it going. And to your original question, I don't know if term limits are the answer. I used to not like it. I used to prefer campaign finance reform to make insurgents more competitive. But I don't know. Maybe there is something to the term limits that this turnover means that you can have more and more people involved in the process over time. And so I go back and forth on it. But the reality is that the fact that we have had turnover at multiple levels of government means that more people can be involved.
Gotcha. Yeah, and certainly, Basil, we know that term limits on the city level. Yeah, how effective it's been, that's debatable. Now, on the federal level, we certainly have it for the presidency. We know this and
Mhm.
whatnot. But let's say congressional, every 2 years, I'm running.
Yeah.
So I'm in a constant state of always raising money for the next campaign.
Yeah,
I
yeah, and I'll say just very quickly, I know
uh
Wallace
huh
wants to chime in.
uh huh.
Part of the problem is the seniority structure, right? You don't
Mm,
have power unless you've been there for a minute,
right. That's
right?
right. That's right.
And that's that even for the voter, they weigh that calculus. Like, do I want to take out my incumbent who's been there for 20 years. Well, that was always the Charlie Rangel thing, right? Like, this dude could be chairman of Ways and Means. Do you want to take him out now and put in somebody who's going to have to spend another 20 years there just to get to that level again, right? That's always the calculation, often a calculation for a voter.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the progressives in the Democratic Party, because AOC came in and changed that formula a little bit, because just her media presence gave her a level of power that was unusual for
a freshman.
somebody, a freshman, and she came in with some other fresh faces that kind of banded together. And there's always been that push-pull between them and the old line members of the party, and it seems like that's part of the problem that the Democrats have is getting on the same page. So, is there a way that the Democrats can marshal that younger energy for a more cohesive national policy?
I think it's important to remember that Ms. Ocasio-Cortez did not spring full blown from Zeus's brow. Okay, she was part of a there's and Basil, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. In terms of a progressive group that was not particularly interested in electoral politics as much as policy change, and they saw in her somebody who was very telegenic and became media savvy to be able to project that, and she's run with that ball for sure. I don't know that that's a model that can necessarily be followed, and I've got to tell you, perhaps the worst thing, one of the worst things that I saw happen here in New York recently was losing that Amazon project in Queens, which she was in the forefront of, because it seemed like a good progressive thing to do, I guess. But the point that happens, of course, is that there were all kinds of jobs that were lost. I mean, people protest against whether it was at the Kingsbridge Armory or this time the Amazon. The people who are protesting the loudest, they all have jobs. Okay, and so they don't lose anything when that goes away. But imagine if Amazon was there in Queens, and nobody could predict the pandemic, of course. But if Amazon was there right now, it wasn't just the jobs with Amazon; it was the shops, the stores, all of the ancillary and satellite aspects of a local economy that were created because of that. And so I'm, as you can hear, I'm not a big fan. But what I mean, I think they Ocasio-Cortez and her other gang of, I guess, making a gang of
four.
We're very media savvy. But when you say what did they actually have they can point to as accomplishments in Congress over the last few years, not much. Much.
I think Jamal Bowman
said,
said
don't they have the opportunity to bring more younger voters into it? And isn't that something that we desperately need?
Sure, you need the younger voters, but you need to produce some results. Otherwise, they fade away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think Jamal Bowman said it best too. He's part of this younger generation, a member of Congress from Northeast Bronx, which is actually the area I grew up. And was endorsed by AOC. When Biden passed the Infrastructure Reduction Act, I think that was the bill in question. Bowman said, he didn't go to Congress realizing that if you get 20% of what you want, it's a victory that should be celebrated. And he's right. The problem when you get sent to DC, or you get sent to any legislative body believing that you're going to change the world, because that's kind of why you ran in the first place, right? But then you get there and you've got 400 plus other people, 500 plus other people, if you include the Senate, minds to make up, right? And people to persuade. And that generally means that, you're not going to get everything you want. And I think there was a learning, there was the lesson learned by a lot of those progressives over time that, just being anti something doesn't work. And you necessarily have to moderate. You pick and choose your battles, no question about it, but you have to moderate. And so I guess the question is, not the question, but I guess the point being that their victories and their elections should be models for a lot of young people to want to run for office and get engaged. I think it's really important. It is, Wallace is absolutely right that it wasn't just a singular act, that there was a larger movement sort of bolstering their candidacies. But at the same time, running for office, running for Congress isn't the only way you can get involved. You know, you could go to the school board level. You could be a tenant activist. You could be a community board member. You know, there are so many ways that you can get involved and engaged, and do it early in your career. People, you know, you talk about shiny objects. People just say, "I want to be mayor. I want to be in Congress." Like that's not. There are many other ways to be involved, and I think that's one of the lessons for young people to take away.
Right. I've worked for directly for one mayor and been appointed by two other mayors positions. You may not necessarily want to be mayor. You know, when you find out what that job is, you may not want to be mayor. You know, that's for sure. Um,
Well, okay, and then backing out, we certainly do know that crime was one of the key issues that was pushed to the forefront in terms of the mayoral election. Former police officer. Actually, I think he maybe even changed party affiliations, if I'm not mistaken. But having said that, his job was really to bring down, reduce crime. However, when he's taken office, we've had some incidents in the subways and on the streets or whatever that point to the fact that it's a lot larger than just somebody getting in there and having some really, really restrictive laws. How can he change that narrative there now that he's in office? Basil.
Well, part of the problem is that reducing crime is just really hard.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
it is not something that happens overnight, like filling a pothole or plowing snow. No, there are so many factors that go into reducing crime that it is a long-term strategy. The key for any mayor is, do your residents feel safe? It's not just
Perception.
about it's not just about that reducing the numbers, because the mayor would argue that crime has gone down in certain
Yeah.
categories.
Hmm.
Um, and this is something that cities across the country are experiencing. So it's not just a New York City problem.
Gotcha.
So
Gotcha.
the question is, how do you convince voters of two things? One, that you're on the job
Hmm.
and you're focused, and B, that they should feel safe. And I think um, uh, one the answer to the first part is, you come to New Yorkers and you consistently tell them what you're doing. Like, people just want to know what you're doing to affect the change. So as long as you're having that conversation, you're actually talking to voters. Say, this is what we did today. This is what we're doing. This is how you give voters a sense that you're actually working on it. And B, even the police presence in some places makes people feel that they're a little safe.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
also, when they see certain things, they could feel unsafe. So even
Right.
if you could say that crime has gone down, but they see people sleeping on the platform, they're not
Hmm.
going to feel like the city is working. You know, we
Hmm.
call we call that bricks and mortar politics. Like,
Mm,
it's not the policy that's behind it. It's what people can see and access and touch, and what they experience every day. It's like when you go across the street and you don't see the park swings fixed, right? Like,
mhm, mhm.
you see that there's no grass, there's mostly patches of dirt, right? Or there's graffiti in the park, right? Like, when you see that, you're like, what's happening? Why isn't anybody doing something about it? And that's what you need to keep from happening with the voter, right? So
Mhm.
and the problem, not problem, but the challenge for the mayor is, how do you do that humanely? How do
Mm,
you do that
yeah,
and not have
yeah.
the heavy hand of a Rudy Giuliani, right? And
Mhm.
so that's part of the real challenge, um, for this mayor.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
one of the things I would mention, and it's a great question, and it's literally one of the things that I teach in our public administration classes at Medgar College, which is in Brooklyn, and the school was actually had to close down for part of a day about a week or so ago because of a shooting right around the corner from
Mm.
where the school is. It was
Mm.
in the daytime. But there's two aspects to public policy, of course, which is one is as Basil correctly pointed out, there's the objective aspects, which is what are the numbers? The numbers of this, there's fewer, what have you, and in many categories, crime is down or is certainly not spiking. But the other is subjective, all right, and it's absolutely how people feel. And in this day of social media, where literally and the press is and the media. The traditional media, they're all over the place. Every single incident that happens becomes news these days, and so you have this feeling that it's very dangerous. Regardless of the statistics, say that subways are pretty safe these days, but you hear about somebody getting thrown on a subway on the subway tracks. I don't care about the statistics anymore, right?
Right.
I care about how I feel, or how if I had my son's now 25, but if he was 7 or 8, 9 or 10 going on the subway by himself, I'd feel pretty concerned about that right now for sure. And so that is the balance that the mayor, any elected official has to deal with. And you don't get a lot of slack as a mayor when these kinds of things happen. And he does show, there's a shoot here in Harlem, right? There's a shooting 2-3 days after he became mayor. 2 police officers were killed,
Yep.
right around the corner from where I live, right? And so he's there at the hospital. He's there comforting the families. He's going to the funerals and all those kinds of things, and trying to be present, which is extremely important. Something that I think the most previous mayor, De Blasio, never really quite picked up on. Being present is being so important with respect to this. So I would just say that with respect to this crime situation, and again, I'd have to echo what Basil was saying, is that we don't want to see the Giuliani era of police and law enforcement, because that is black and brown people, get the short end of that every single time. I don't know anybody who wasn't stopped by the police, who's black, who wasn't stopped by the police, particularly during the first 4 years of the Giuliani era, for just, who are you, what are you doing, what's going on. And when I'd ask students in my class, several years later, how many of you have ever been stopped by the police during the stop and frisk era? Oh man, all their hands went up, male and female. Okay,
Wow.
yeah,
Wow.
and so we don't want to go back to that.
Yeah, and I'll say just very quickly, because I think this does tie into an earlier question, which is, how can the party respond? Because oftentimes when crime is brought up, it's often racialized and urbanized, right?
Yes. Yes.
You see Republicans doing that. Lee Zeldin has done that in the state
Mm-hmm.
as he's running for governor. But the truth is, black people care about crime too.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what's interesting to me is that as the party as a whole has really kind of missed an opportunity to really talk about this issue in a meaningful way nationally, because you have someone like an Eric Adams, a black Democrat, that ran on crime, on reducing crime, particularly hate crime, against
Yes.
Asian Americans, against the Jewish community, right?
Yes.
You have Val Demings, who was the chief of police in Florida,
Yes.
who running for Senate. She certainly can talk about what it means to tackle crime, especially if you're a person of color, and do it in a way that is respectful and responsive to those communities. So I think it was a bit of a lost opportunity for those, and this is, again, these new leaders, these young leaders who you could elevate, give them a platform, and really change the face, literally and figuratively, of the party.
Well, see, just on that point, when the progressives started going around talking about defund the police, that may have been about the dumbest damn thing I've ever heard anybody say in a political context. Because and again, again, I'm born in Harlem, lived here most of my life. I don't know anybody who wants fewer police. I don't know. I just never met anybody that said, no, I don't think we need so many police around here. It just doesn't happen. But this defund the police. I remember I moderated a panel with one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement was there, and I said, "Well, you don't really mean fewer police, do you?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Well, that doesn't make any sense. Not in the neighborhood where I live, and in most black neighborhoods, nobody wants fewer police. We want fair police.
Yes.
We want just police, but we don't. But fewer police? You got to be kidding." And of course, Republicans have seized upon that to tar the entire Democratic Party with that nonsense. You know,
Yes.
and that's where I have problems with my so-called progressive brothers and sisters. I think I'm progressive too, but I also try to be pragmatic. And that was just a dumb, one more time, dumb thing to do. And it's like a ball and chain being carried around by anybody who poses as a Democrat these days. Ridiculous.
Well, I guess one of the things we'll have to say is that happening on Tuesday is the midterms, and so Dr. Smikle, you're telling me that we're going to suffer some losses, particularly in the House, but the Senate may look a little bit promising. Is that correct?
I think, well, we've got, I think, a better shot of retaining the Senate, but
Okay, nice.
uh,
Even so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
Herschel Walker
How
can
does
run.
Senator Herschel Walker sound to you?
Yes. Oh my God.
well, the
Oh my
one
goodness.
thing that I'm going to be looking, there's sort of two quick things. One
Mhm.
is in New York. One of the things that I'm looking at is whether or not Lee Zeldin's popularity in Long Island means that that Republicans flip some state Senate seats. And this goes way back to something that Wallace mentioned at the very beginning, the importance of state politics. I still think the state Senate will have a Democratic majority, but we may lose some seats in the state Senate and the Assembly in this election if Lee Zeldin's numbers in the polling, are close to being accurate.
Yeah.
Nationally, one of the things I'm looking at is the ticket splitters. Like we talk about it, and though it generally doesn't happen as often as we think among voters, but
Mhm.
in a case like Georgia, where you have Stacey Abrams running for governor and Warnock
Yeah.
running for Senate, there are a lot of voters that don't hate Kemp, the incumbent, but
Right.
they may vote. So they may vote for him and may vote for Warnock because they want to keep Democratic control of the Senate because of
Gotcha.
things like voting rights and reproductive rights that are on the ballot, so to speak. So I'm
So-
looking at that dynamic, the potential for it.
Gotcha.
So you mentioned reproductive rights. How much of a thing is that actually going to be in this election?
I think it's baked in already. I'll just say quickly, so but I think it's baked in already. The question is, for a lot of those voters, do they live in a state where they don't have to worry about it as much? So, for example, in the polling for governor, we see that abortion rights doesn't actually rate that high compared to the economy and threats to democracy. Why? Because if you live in a state like New York, our governor will likely protect, assuming it's a Democrat, is likely going to protect reproductive rights, right? And this legislature, as currently constituted, certainly will do that. But if you live in another state, like Kansas, where it was on the ballot, or other states where it will be on the ballot, it's going to be, it's certainly going to be something that motivates a lot of voters.
Yeah, there's 26 states that right now abortion rights are already severely compromised, and obviously that means that there's any number of members of Congress and Senate coming from there. But if the polls are to be any indication, abortion rights has really dropped down in terms of the to-do list, if you will, way after the economy. And inflation and those kinds of things. So, I'm not sanguine about what's going to happen with respect to abortion rights going forward. It's going to be a very difficult time.
Gotcha.
So-
Night Watchman.
Yeah, we got to start wrapping up.
But we have to have them back. We have to have a post-election. We got to find out how we do it
Yeah.
going forward. So go ahead, Night Watchman.
Right, we'll find out if our prognostications are correct or not. I hope that we do better than we're thinking we're doing. But let's have some last words, starting with Basil. Just some final thoughts.
My only final thought is go vote, man. I mean, it is.
Yes.
I was saying this yesterday because I voted early on Thursday, and I voted given who we all are and where we're from. I voted after coming back from Calvin Butts's
yes.
And I'm reminded that Calvin was a major player, not just among Democrats, but among Republicans.
That's
Yes,
right.
absolutely,
That's
His
right.
support for George Pataki and his support for Mike Bloomberg. Now, if we step away from party politics, and I say this all the time, I'm black before I'm a Democrat. I'm a black Democrat, but I'm a black first, Democrat second.
Nice.
And when I moved to Harlem, in my 20s, the first apartment that I lived in Central Harlem was a brownstone that Calvin's organization renovated.
Ah, yes,
And
yes,
throughout
yes.
the City and Development Corporation. And I
Mm-hmm.
say that to say that, you know, politics matters, representation matters, who we put into power matters, elections matter, and to all of our lives, and in many ways we don't even think about. And it's hard for me to think about the fact that some people fought and died to give me a right that I take for granted.
Yes, yes.
That always weighs on my conscience, and so I say, if nothing else, you know, honor the people who aren't around anymore because of a right that you may be taking for granted. So, vote.
All
Beautiful,
right.
beautiful. Well said.
Well spoken.
Dr. Ford.
Yeah, just to follow up on that point, I teach at a school that's named after Medgar Evers,
Mm-hmm.
who was killed just for trying to register people to vote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I don't know that we take that legacy as seriously as we should as Black Americans. That this was a right that was fought for, and people literally died for, going back well over 100, 150 years. And it should be a tradition in our community for everyone to vote. And in some families, that is the case. I talk to my students sometimes, and are you registered? No. Are you going to vote? No. And I tell them, and to echo what Basil was just saying, is that if you don't vote, then you are not part of the process.
Yes.
Where that determines what happens in your life. And so either you're at the table or you're on the menu. And so I think if you want to be at the table, then you better go vote. And so hopefully, for those people who haven't voted by the time they're watching this show on Monday, please get your butt out there and vote on Tuesday.
Beautiful, beautiful. Dr. Smikle, Dr. Ford, excellent. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for this.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you
it's
so
a
much.
pleasure.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Once
Thank you.
again, you've been listening to Soul Lounge Prime Time on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Also live streaming on YouTube and Facebook. If you consume this content on those platforms, make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and more importantly, share this information, because these conversations we are having are critically important for us. And if you're listening to this the night before the election, get on the phone right now. Make sure the people you know are voting.
Yes. Guys, thank you all.